Thank you to everyone for joining our Yachad New Israel Fund belated Yom Ha'atzmaut event. I'll start with some very brief introductions, and then we can move on to hearing from our speakers, which is why you're all here this evening. I'll let everyone introduce themselves in detail, but we're really pleased to be joined by three British Jews who made the choice of moving to Israel and are now working with different organizations in the Israeli human rights community. So thank you to our three speakers, Joel Carmel of Breaking the Silence, Rebecca Metzer from Gisha, and Anton Goodman from Rabbis for Human Rights. And if you don't know me, I'm Danielle Bett. I'm Yachad's Director of Communications. I'm a British Jew, Scottish Israeli combination, and I'm really honored to be chairing this joint NIF Yachad event. If you're not familiar with our two organizations, Yachad is a British Jewish organization whose primary mission is to empower British Jews to support a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We do this through working with our British Jewish community in the British Parliament, with members of Parliament cross-party, and with key partners on the ground, such as the guests who are joining us this evening. And our good friends at the New Israel Fund partner with and fund Israeli organizations that work to defend democracy, to deliver a fair society for all, and they empower minorities and marginalized people in Israel, defend democracy and human rights for Israelis and Palestinians, and advance partnership between Arab and Jewish leaders and communities. So that is my swift introduction and who's done. I will say we'll start off with some questions, but the Q&A function is open, so please feel free to ask questions through this evening, either to specific panelists or to everyone more broadly. So moving on to our speakers, obviously this is a Israeli Independence Day event, coming late, but it's been a really strange one for a lot of people, both in the diaspora and in Israel, with everything that's happening, for many different reasons, and we'll dive further into that. But as a starting point, it would be great if everyone could introduce themselves and tell us a bit about your background, why you chose to move to Israel, and why you chose in particular to work in this very difficult field of defending human rights. So if I could start with Joel, if that's okay.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel. I grew up in northwest London, probably like the other two as well, and I grew up really at the heart of the Jewish community. Was very involved in my kind of synagogue life, and I went to JFS and went to Noam and then Bnei Akiva. So kind of got this very good education, very rounded education with a very central message from all of those institutions, that Israel is a very big part of my identity. And it's not just something that they kind of like implanted in me. It was very much from home as well. And it was obvious to me from a very young age that my future was in Israel. The UK was a great place, very happy to have the privilege to be brought up there. But I always saw Israel as the place that I wanted to spend my future in. And with time, it became clear that I wanted to do that as soon as possible as well. I found myself making Aliyah when I was straight after school. Like, I spent a year in yeshiva in Israel, and then officially made Aliyah after that. I made it to, I mean, as we're obliged to do, I went to the IDF, served in a unit called COGAT, which stands for Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories. And I think it was already kind of coming in with a bit of a critical outlook on the occupation, or the way that like the state and the army deal with this situation of being in control of lots of Palestinians. That was something that was it was apparent to me to a certain extent from the beginning, but became clearer and clearer as time went on. And I became part of, like, I was in a position of being in power, and that was something that was very strange to me, and felt, especially as a young person, that it wasn't right. And then obviously there were certain events along the way which eventually made it very clear to me that I couldn't really carry on like that and have a clear conscience. I finished my army service after a like the standard 3 years, and I found myself a few years later thinking about where I could take not only my frustration and disappointment in what I'd seen in the army, but also my kind of hope for doing something a bit better. And that for me was breaking the silence, where I could give my testimony and kind of work together with other like-minded people to try to bring the occupation to an end, with a view of making this place better for us Israelis and our Palestinian neighbors. So that's very shortly. And I live in Jerusalem, and I'm married, and I have 2 kids, and so that's also, I mean, maybe we'll talk about that later, about that being part of my reasons for being here today.
So I think I'll go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca. I'm getting married and I have 2 cats, quite unruly cats. So if there's an interruption from them, then apologies in advance. I live in Tel Aviv now. I've lived here for nearly 2 years. And before that, I lived in Jerusalem for a year. Like Jojo or Joel, I also grew up in the Northwest London Jewish community. I went to Jewish primary school, had a very strong foundation in Jewish knowledge. I also attended an Orthodox synagogue growing up. I went to a non-Jewish secondary school where I began to be exposed to more close friends who came from different cultures, different backgrounds, and we were all kind of forming our political views, I guess, as we go. And that became even stronger at university, where I met people outside London. Wow, it was a really life-changing experience. So growing up, I used to come to Israel and also the occupied territories twice a year around, meaning that when I moved, when I was around 25, I'd been around 50 times already. My cousins grew up in a settlement, so we used to go and visit them. Obviously, when I was very young, I didn't understand anything was different. I understood it all to be Israel. There used to be these kind of signs or small indicators that it was a bit different. We used to get a text on our phone saying, smell the olives, taste the olives and smell the jasmine. Joel welcomes you to Palestine. And we were like, what's this? Is this like historical? Is this, I don't know what's happening. We didn't really see many Palestinians. Obviously, we were driving on roads which only Israeli cars could go on. And, you know, very strong security in the settlements, which only allowed mostly Jews to come in, otherwise, you know, workers or whatever that we weren't really seeing going in and out of the settlement. And like Jojo, I also grew up within a very strong Zionist tradition. Obviously in Jewish primary school, it was very emphasized of the importance of Israel and, you know, dancing in blue and white on Yom Ha'atzmaut. And all of those things, I think, led me to have a very strong love for Israel. I also, as a London kid, definitely experienced a lot of freedom when I would come to Israel and also to the settlements. I would be able to suddenly go to the shops by myself and walk out late at night and do all of these things that I couldn't do at home. And for me, that was like complete freedom, complete bliss. So I think that all of those things gave me a very strong attraction to moving to Israel. But I think, as I said, I began to be more and more politicized about my views surrounding Israel, especially at university. And I really started to challenge those opinions and perspectives that I'd grown up with from across my community. And I think that I overwhelmingly had a sense of curiosity when I moved here. I think I was very agnostic about what is the situation politically, what is, the reality on the ground, and I wanted to see with my own eyes, and I definitely think that's what happened. I think we're going to talk a bit more about how our views on Israel have developed and changed while we've lived here, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but yeah, that was what led me to move.
Nice to introduce myself after Rebecca, and nice to do it digitally because I'm allergic to cats, so it's good to be on Zoom. My name is Anton Goodman. I grew up in Oxford in a small Jewish community. Raise the roof if you're from there. I moved to Israel about 20 years ago, just over. My formative moment, my formative experience and memories of Israel was really coming on an Israel tour at 16 years old with Bnei Akiva. In the height of the Oslo Accords and the social upheaval within Israeli society. And when I returned to England, I felt very connected to Israel to such an extent that when Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, I made the decision to fly out to Israel with a couple of friends and to come to the funeral. And that moment, looking back, remains, imprinted on my memory. Seeing young people my age, 16 years old, on the streets, lighting candles, playing guitars, singing. And within that, that great depth of desperation and sadness at that time, I felt a lot of hope still. I felt this is a country that has the ability to define its future. This is a generation of politically aware kids who have agency, who actually can go on the streets and maybe change something. And it was at that stage that I decided that I wanted to move to Israel. And so I moved to Israel in 2002 in the height of the Second Intifada. And I lived in Jerusalem and experienced conflict much too close to home. And at that time, I was working for World Bnei Akiva. I worked for World Bnei Akiva for 10 years, and I saw up close and personal the religious radicalization of my community, of the changing values within that community, and desperately tried to push back on it. And from my early time in Israel, I was always trying to push back from within. And until today, I still tried to push back from within. It's been frustrating and unsuccessful. And I feel that Israel has changed much during this time. But I still feel that, that 16-year-old, that British Jew who was inspired by the kind of social dynamism of the Israeli street, still the same person. And yesterday was the opening of the summer session of the Knesset, and I was on the streets again with 10,000 of my closest friends, calling for the fall of this corrupt government and elections. Nice to be here.
Thank you, everyone. I still always find it, so I grew up in Israel and then moved to the UK when I was 15. So I've had quite a backwards experience. I still always find it so interesting to hear like the diaspora connection and how people move here. And it's still sometimes baffling to me, the experience that people go through in the diaspora. I guess everyone's kind of touched on this slightly, but it would be interesting to hear how your perception of Israel has changed and how your own personal views, whether it be on Zionism or on politics or anything, even the relationship you have with the diaspora now has changed over the years, be it in the past year or however back you want to go. Yeah, you don't have to obviously go in the order that we started in, so I'll let you feel free to start.
The classic British event with too much politeness. But I saw that Rebecca, you unmuted, so go for it. I was just being glib.
I just thought that you would both think that the woman should start. So I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna have to start. Because I know you both.
Now you've made me look terrible.
I'll start. So when I moved to, as I said, I moved with a lot of curiosity, and I immediately enrolled in an ulpan, and I got to know a friend of mine in the ulpan said, why don't you come with me to do some activism? And I was like, yeah, I love activism. I did activism in university. I was very, very involved with the FemSoc there, and also the Jewish Society, and I think that would be a great thing for me to do. So I ended up going on both a Gisha tour and a Breaking the Silence tour, which is fabulous for me because I've worked at both of those organizations now. But I didn't know that at the time, that it would be so life-changing and influential for me. And I think that, you know, regarding, Danielle, what you said about our perceptions of Israel from the diaspora, I think I was very struck by both in myself, my own resistance, and also in general, our community, our diasporic community's resistance to actually seeing the reality on the ground for what it is. I feel like the same chants which can be said in protests in the middle of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, when they're said in the diaspora, and I don't exempt myself from this, and I think our whole community kind of have our backs up to the reality of what's going on, and it's very, very hard sometimes to face it and also to stomach it. And I think that that was my experience. So for me, hearing these people from the Israeli left talk about the reality on the ground and human rights, you know, things that I hold so close to my heart and still do, it was very helpful to get it from the Israeli left, because it was people that I knew that their agenda was purely to expose the reality. And I found that it was something that very much eased me into my life here. And I've now worked in 3 civil society organizations here. I think this one's going to stick, so that's great. But I think that, you know, it definitely brought me into that world. One other moment that I guess I'll kind of pick out, as well as the Gisha tours on the Gaza border, a lot about movement and access and the Israeli policy, which creates this blockade on Gaza. The Breaking the Silence tour that I went on was in Hebron, and I'm sure that Jojo can speak more to that. But I also went across Kalandia checkpoint with a friend of mine who was working in the West Bank at the time. And I think that image of seeing people queuing to exercise their right to freedom of movement while I could just sail past. And as I said, Israel was always my playground. It was a place where I had this ultimate freedom, that I could do anything I wanted. And I started to understand that that freedom was at the expense of the freedom of an entire people, and actually the indigenous population. And that really didn't sit right with me. And I think one other thing that I'll mention before I pass on to Anton is that I think I was also, to this day, I remain very baffled and quite disillusioned and heartbroken about the rejection of civil society from within Israeli broader society. Human rights is seen as almost a dirty word here. It's seen as equating you with being some kind of foreign agent or someone with a foreign agenda who wants to undermine Israeli sovereignty. And I think that that is so distinct from my Jewish education at home in the diaspora, where obviously first and foremost charity when I was very young, and then that kind of developing into a more political idea of equality and human rights. I saw that as part and parcel of my religious education. So I think that's something that it actually continues to shock me to this day, in terms of my perception of the society here and my life here. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I want to share that in 2010 to 13, I was the Jewish agency Shaliach, the emissary to Washington, D.C. in the States. And it was still a hopeful time to be in the United States, you know, straddling both candidacies of President Obama, the feeling that maybe things could be improving. And the reason that I was chosen to go was that there was a growing awareness of the divide and the gap between American Jewish values and Israeli policy. And the Jewish Agency specifically recruited a group of Israel engagers who were from the left wing of Israeli society, who could engage with the American Jewish discourse. And for 3 years, on every platform or stage or panel that I was on, I argued, hopefully, that democratic mainland Israel would cure the occupation. That we had the fortitude and the values of democracy within Israel that would come and say, you can't run an occupation anymore. There's no such thing as a democratic state that's running an occupation, and that it would solve it. And I was desperately wrong, because what actually happened was the occupation infected mainland Israel. And rather than talking about how we've changed, because all people change, let's talk about how Israel has changed. And we're looking at a country now where the democratic values, have hit rock bottom. The attacks on Israeli democracy are coming from the same people who are the biggest supporters of the occupation, because those values don't exist anymore in the same way. We're looking at a society which has really embraced military conflict and military solutions when there is no military solution to this conflict. And I think that I find it, earth-shattering that Israelis are still calling for strong military response and more military incursion and incursions into Rafah and more lives to be lost. And we're 6 months into this bloody, tragic conflict. And what has been achieved through military conflict? And so these days, with Rabbis for Human Rights, we meet very regularly with post-high school Israeli teenagers through pre-military academies. And I think probably Jojo and Rebecca also meet with these groups as well. And they often come to attack and to kind of expose how naive or how traitorous you are in your belief in peace or your hopes for peace. And I always say to them, look at you. In many ways, this is a generation I find inspirational in terms of some of the social advances that have been made. But when you look at Israeli youth, 18, 19-year-old Israelis, they have never experienced in their lifetime a peace process. They don't know what it looks like. They think it's a fiction. The only prime minister they've ever really known is Netanyahu. And their whole perception has led them to be experts. This very high level of expertise of why no solution can work. An explanation of why anything that you say is wrong, is naive, is stupidity. But Israel has stolen from them the ability to imagine a peaceful future here. It is a theft of a whole generation. And that is deeply, deeply unsettling to meet that time and time again. And Jojo, I'm sure you have those experiences as well with Breaking the Silence. And, we're all trying to meet the mainstream Israeli public and to impact on them. And it's becoming more and more difficult. So maybe that's a segue for you, Jojo.
Yeah, I was actually in Hebron today with a group from one of these pre-military academies, and they were quite a rare example of a group of kids who were genuinely curious about the possibilities. And I came out of the tour today with like a very good feeling, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. And I think, I kind of have mixed feelings about these groups, but I always feel like it's important to talk to them anyway, because there's some, if they don't meet, when they don't meet us, they won't meet someone else necessarily who's from our kind of side of the political spectrum, but they definitely will meet the people who are telling them that there's definitely no hope for peace. Anyway, what I wanted to say was that I kind of grew up with this feeling, and again, this has a lot to do with my kind of the institutions that I was a part of. But I think generally the feeling was, the attitude was that there's not really any room for criticism of Israel, because it felt to us like any kind of protest outside the Israeli embassy, or critical piece in a newspaper or on the BBC or anything like that was really legitimate. And that was why I had a huge flag of Israel on my bedroom wall, and I would take it down every time there was some kind of protest to go to, because I felt very committed and very passionate about, defending Israel's right to exist. And I would take down that flag and be, the first one there to show the world that, Israel has a right to defend itself and Israel has a right to exist. And I think it was a very unnuanced view of the reality, definitely of within Israel, but generally of what Israel was doing. And I kind of don't really blame myself, but I think as time has gone by, I feel like, or the more time that goes by, the more I feel like, the responsible thing for us to do as people who do see a future in this place and do, have a deep commitment to making this place better, is to be critical. And that's something that I expect of myself and my fellow Israeli citizens, and I expect of our friends around the world as well, because I think that it's something that we can't do without. And definitely when we're in a situation like we're in, where we need help. And I don't think that's something to be ashamed of. And when people ask me today about my Zionism, or about my kind of my feeling about being in Israel, I might embarrass myself here, but I kind of think of this as the my Fiddler on the Roof Zionism, which is, and I don't know, whoever's here familiar with Fiddler on the Roof, in the song "Do You Love Me?" Golda says, after 25 years, I cook for you, I clean for you, I don't know, I've had your kids, I've raised them. If that's not love, what is? And that's kind of how I feel about being here. I left my family behind, and I came and I served in the army, and I decided to get married here, and I'm raising a family here, and I'm in a job here, and I pay taxes, and I send my kids to nurseries here. And I think if that's not a commitment to Israel's future, then I don't know what is. And it's kind of like every day is a new. I make the decision afresh about being a committed part of the society, and that's something that it comes at a price, and it's difficult, and it's definitely.
Jojo, you've slightly frozen on us. I don't know if to mute or to give you a second. Okay, we'll get back to Jojo. We're expecting Rebecca to have technical issues, but not Jojo. Okay, well, I think it's really interesting that everyone kind of touched on some way or another about this idea of kind of being a traitor in some way, shape, or form. Oh, you're back. Do you want to finish what you were saying? You're on mute. Oh.
I don't know where I was cut off. I'm sorry.
I'm now going to need someone to save me because I'm having a blank.
Jojo, you've done a highly divisive Fiddler in the Roof analogy.
Yeah, we finished the Fiddler in the Roof analogy.
It splits the audience into two: those who deeply identified with what you said, and those who were triggered by how Jewy it was.
It was very well. I had a very passionate speech there, and I don't think I'll be able to do it very well this time. But I was saying that I think that having all of these, like being committed to Israel in the way I am is, it's something that I'm just as passionate about today in a very different way, but just as passionate today as I was when I was 15 and 16 and going to these protests outside the Israeli embassy. And I think it's something that, it's difficult and it's a very sad time in Israel, but I think I'm actually proud of us as a political camp for withstanding this. It's withstanding lots of attacks and being able to continue with our good fight, I hope.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to comment on, I think everyone has made this point in one way, shape, or form of kind of being called, I think Anton, you said traitorous, and Rebecca, you also mentioned like human rights being a dirty word, but it feels like the bar has become lower and lower for what counts as being called a traitor in this country. So it used to be like breaking the silence or B'Tselem or like very like human rights organizations, but now, and then it became the word left, and now it's become anyone who shows up at a protest is a traitor in some way, shape, or form. So it's kind of any form of resistance or even argument really seems to have turned Israelis into not fit for purpose, or traitors to the country, even Israelis who've served in the army and who dedicate their, well, like you say, Jojo, pay their taxes and do everything here. And I think that's a really interesting and very sad reflection on reflections, seeing as this is Israeli Independence Day kind of event. I mean, I think everyone will know and acknowledge it's been a very strange Independence Day from any way that you look at it. It didn't feel like the usual Yom Ha'atzmaut, which would usually be kind of fireworks and parties and things. And even the people who aren't in our camp on the left, with taking into account with the hostages, Israeli hostages in Gaza, people didn't feel like this was a time of celebration, with so many people who've been evacuated from the north and south and don't know when they'll return home. And for many of us watching what's happening in Gaza, it does not feel like we can celebrate our independence when Palestinians don't have independence, and also when this endless war is continuing. So I guess on that kind of somber note, what are your broad reflections on either Yom Ha'atzmaut, but also just Israel at 76? How would you summarize things? I'll start with Jojo.
Yeah, I jumped in there. Well, it's obviously a very difficult time for all of us. I don't know. It's very difficult for me to see. There've been comments from people on the right actually who are talking about this as like a wonderful time. Quite a well-known Israeli commentator, Ynnon Magal, was interviewed for like a primetime interview program a few months ago, and he said, it's a wonderful period of time. Why? Because people are already coming together and behind this war, right? So and that was really difficult to listen to, but I think it's an attitude that does prevail in some parts of Israeli society. And for me, this Yom Ha'atzmaut, it was the first time in my life, I think, that I sat out. I didn't participate in anything because it just felt like, how can I be celebrating when our hostages are somewhere deep in the ground in Gaza, and our government isn't doing anything to get them out of there, and we're on this like very bloody campaign in Gaza, which doesn't seem to be ending. And I really hope that next year on Yom Ha'atzmaut I'll have something to want to participate in. And this isn't Joel Carmel boycotts Yom Ha'atzmaut. I don't think it's like a big deal, but just for me, I didn't feel like it was appropriate for me to be celebrating. But I think there was this moment not too long ago, a couple of months ago, which really was for me a sign of the times. And that was just after the first round of sanctions had been placed by the US, UK, I think then France, and other countries on violent settlers. At the beginning, they were kind of, I'm in these WhatsApp groups of like extremist settlers because I just didn't, I'm interested in seeing what they say. And at the beginning, they were kind of laughing it off, saying, oh, we don't want to go to the US anyway, who cares? And then their bank accounts were frozen. And then they cared a lot. And in response to that, the heads of the major banks in Israel were summoned to a Knesset committee hearing. I guess the finance committee, and they were challenged on how dare you freeze bank accounts to Israeli citizens. And basically, the response of the heads of the banks was, "What do you want? Like, we are part of a worldwide financial system, and in order for Israel's economy to work, we need to have these connections with partners abroad." And they basically put it to the Israeli political class, saying, this is a political problem, and you need to make a decision whether you want to side with the violent extremists who are, by Israel's own standards, breaking the law and doing terrible things to Palestinians, or if you want to side with us, the Israeli economy. And I think putting that, obviously it didn't make much of an impression on the right-wing members of Knesset, but I think that statement of you need to decide, which side you're on, is something that really is very appropriate. It's a question that's very appropriate for us asking as we enter this new year of Israel's independence, which is, what side are we on? And I hope it's something that mainstream, middle of the road Israelis who for many years have not been very politically active and definitely haven't really thought very much about the occupation. I hope that's a question that people will start asking themselves.
Rebecca?
Sure, happy to chime in next. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, which I really appreciate. I think that I've definitely been doing a lot of reflecting since Yom Ha'atzmaut about what do we mean when we talk about independence. And I think that one of the issues is that the notion of independence, and I think as an offshoot of that, sovereignty, Israeli sovereignty, has become this, there's almost a pride point in Israel and Israeli society about being more and more isolated from the international community. And this cynical use of the kind of playing off the genuine rise in anti-Semitism to claim that all criticism of Israel and of the government is anti-Semitic. I think that it's become almost, as I said, a kind of a point of pride to be as uninvolved as possible in the kind of global movements and the international community, and that being some kind of a sign of Israel's independence. And I think that the absolute opposite is true. I think that to be independent is to recognize that at our heart, we're all actually interdependent. And in order to have these boundaries, we have to also welcome relationships with our region, obviously with the Palestinians first and foremost, but also with the rest of the region and obviously the world at large. So I think that's one thing that I've been thinking about. And I think the other thing I've been thinking about is the kind of the responsibility that comes with independence. The dream of a Jewish state is to have this this whole system of all of the things that we have in statehood, the governance, judiciary, security forces, everything else, and for that to be defined by its Judaism. And whether or not you agree with that, that is the reality that we're in and have been in for decades. And I think that there's yet to be a reckoning of what kind of responsibility that independence lends, because at the moment, Israel is ruling over millions of Palestinians under military law. Israel is carrying out this military operation in Gaza, which has killed over 35,000 people, displaced a huge majority of the population, many multiple times. And ultimately, Israel has a responsibility for all of the civilians living under our control. And I think that that hasn't really sunk in, that independence is all very well and good, but you have to also accept the responsibilities and obligations that come with that. And as an occupying power, Israel has duties and obligations under international law, and also morally, I would go so far as to say, to all of the civilians in Gaza, in the West Bank, as well as in Israel's borders itself. So I think that it's, as Jojo mentioned, it's definitely not an easy time. I was very, very lucky to be able to attend the joint ceremony, which Parent Circle and Competence for Peace put on. I haven't been asked to plug it. It was truly a wonderful event, and I really recommend anyone to watch the YouTube recording of that. I think that unfortunately, and I've come back to this again and again, unfortunately in our society, not only is human rights seen as a kind of traitorous worldview, but compassion is seen as threatening. And I think that the idea of mourning and grieving together, Palestinians and Israelis, is a massive threat to the current regime. It's the last thing that the government wants, is for us to realize that each other are human. So for me, that was the only way that I could celebrate or mark Yom Ha'atzmaut this year. So yeah, it's a very difficult time, but as Jojo said, next year in Yerushalayim Habnuyah, where with equality and freedom for everyone.
And I think that we're all expressing some of these very difficult feelings around the national days this year. And as I travel around Israel, in every city, there's signs, there's billboards, Yachad Nenatzach, together we will win. As I travel through Israel and through the West Bank, I haven't met anyone who's winning. I'm only seeing people losing, whether it's going to Shiva homes and consoling friends who have lost their children, or it's seeing human rights violations to innocent Palestinian communities in the West Bank. Ain't nobody winning here. And that kind of mythical narrative that is being pushed out at the moment is like a Masada complex that is going to end badly for all of us. And so this Yom Ha'atzmaut, I mean, I still feel like we're experiencing as well the realities of the general elections of November 2022 and a government coalition that brings the most violent settlers, Jewish terrorists, into the highest office in the land. And what stood out for me on Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut around the national days was the attacking of humanitarian aid trucks going through the West Bank to Gaza. Rabbis for Human Rights does a lot of work providing protective presence for Palestinian farming communities and shepherds. These are communities who are, deeply in tune with the land, living modest, humble lives, and have a lot of wisdom to share, actually. You gain a lot from spending time with these communities. And they are facing a kind of ultra-nationalist terror with a complete lack of law enforcement that is targeting them as if they're directly responsible for the crimes and the massacre of October the 7th. And so since humanitarian aid's been sent to the Gaza Strip, there's been an Israeli organization called Sav Tesha. Sav Shmone is like general conscription when you call up reservists. Sav Tesha, they call themselves as if it's they're not in the army, but they're going to go and stop the aid trucks. They created obstacles at Kerem Shalom and other borders into Gaza. But in Yom HaZikaron that changed, and I'm also in the settler groups as well, Jojo. And when we say settlers, we're talking about a certain breed of settler, a certain ideology, a messianic, apocalyptic Judaism that is betraying our values and that has found leadership positions well above its station. And in these groups, they started to say, we are going to be taking over from Savtasha. And what they started doing, and they're very successful in energizing their community and, recruiting many dozens of people immediately, was that they put out an announcement, and it's happening every day. Put out an announcement. There's humanitarian aid trucks. They're going through the Tarkumia crossing. They're going, they're in the Yitzhar area. Come to the road, and suddenly you have 50, 60, 100 hilltop youth and others, not so young anymore, hilltop adults, who attack the trucks, burning tires, stoning the drivers, almost killing drivers, even when the armies turned to them and said, these aren't even humanitarian aid trucks. But that started on Yom HaZikaron. If there's any illustration of how far we have lost the plot, of the extent to which Jewish values are being destroyed here, it is that this government is not arresting the people who are setting fire to humanitarian aid trucks. And, it's a breaking point. What have we become? And I'm desperately looking for the leadership to crack down on this, to put these people in jail, to open fire with rubber bullets on those who are throwing stones, and to stop this mutation of Jewish identity. And as someone wrote in the chat, maybe there's a split between the Jewish diaspora and Jewish Israel. I hope that there is. I hope that there is a breaking of ties at the moment, so that the Jewish diaspora can stand up with its values and say, this is unacceptable, and not in the name of our Judaism could this happen. And so it's a very hard Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut when you see these behaviors being encouraged in the highest office, and you see the impact on human lives. These are Palestinian lives. These are human lives. There is inherent sanctity to all human life. That is a basic Jewish concept, and we must remember that.
Here. Thank you so much. So we've got quite a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to open up to audience questions. If I could just remind everyone, because I've seen a couple of hands raised, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll try my best to get as many as possible in. So one question that's been come up a couple of times is around exactly what you've just mentioned, which is the diaspora relationship with Israel. And I think a lot of diaspora Jews, as we all know, feel very torn between seeing the rise of anti-Semitism, seeing constant mainstream criticism of Israel and what their role is, and feeling like they have to defend Israel's right to exist. And so that kind of creates a really difficult, not just since October, but for a long time now. Do you think does it seem like the diaspora is becoming more alienated than Israel? Do you feel that you're getting enough support from the diaspora? And just, I guess, any thoughts on the diaspora or Jews across the world and the relationship that they currently have with Israel and the Israeli human rights community? Anyone can start. I'll pick on Anton, just because you had just touched on that, so you can carry on what you were saying.
So I'm happy to share that. Listen, I just finished a talk to a group of a large group of German Christians in Frankfurt. And the amazing thing about German Christians is that there's a similarity with the kind of guilt that they carry of both wanting to support the existence of the state of Israel and yet wanting to stand for human rights and the freedom of Palestinian people. And it's quite remarkable, actually. I mean, it comes from a very different place, as we're well aware. But we all carry this historical baggage and burdens and kind of the narratives, and where does it place us within our communities? I have deep compassion for what is going on in Jewish communities around the world. The Jews are paying the price for the political actions of the Jewish state. And I think that there needs to be, a support group for Jewish communities around the world to say, for the most part, these are Jewish communities who hold liberal values, who believe in, inclusive and equal societies, and who haven't made these political decisions. They're not even citizens of the state of Israel. And yet at the same time, this is a Jewish conversation. This is a conversation about Jewish values. And so it leaves you really caught in the middle of a very difficult place to be finding yourself. And I have a lot of compassion for Jewish people who are struggling with these issues at the time. What I want to say, though, is that over the time that I've lived here, I gain daily more and more love for this land that I believe is inherently holy, and more love for the peoples who live on this land, even those who are misguided. When you meet a human being, you see a human being is an entire world. And more, I understand that there is no inherent sanctity to the state of Israel and the government of Israel. And I think that we need to find some kind of line to draw there and to say, I'm a deep believer in the holiness of this land, of the connection of the Jewish people to this land, and the connection of other peoples to this land, and of the belief that these peoples need to live in safety and security, in dignity and equality. But you don't need to pay any price or any tax to the government of Israel, to the state of Israel, and to the policies that are being advanced. And I know that that's a complex thing to be projecting, but I think it's something that can start to be internalized.
And also just to add, we often get asked what the diaspora can do to help, and obviously both New Israel Fund and Yachad do work with British Jews. So we're kind of part of that work in the diaspora, but it'd be helpful to know if Jojo or Rebecca, if you can add to kind of also what is the role of the diaspora.
I can talk next. I'm happy to. First of all, I just want to echo what Anton said. I think that you very poetically and interestingly really gave us a picture of that relationship between Israel and the diaspora, as well as all of our relationship to this land. And it was really a pleasure to hear you speak. I think that, as always, I think that the call has to be for a kind of strong and moral Jewish leadership, as well as an encouraging of debate and conversation within our communities. I think that the amount of messages that I've had from people in our community who don't like my politics, telling me about what happened on October 7th, while I'm the one who actually live here and was a little bit more proximate to that experience. It truly baffles me, and I think that it speaks to this idea that any of us who raise any kind of criticism or even a questioning voice as to the kind of party line are very at risk of being alienated from our community. And I think that we really have an opportunity as British Jews to try and reach across generational divides and try to be more open and accepting and listening to each other's views. Because I think that while in the States they have a very vibrant and lively kind of Jewish anti-occupation movement, Jewish human rights movement, we know that there's quite a big generational divide. And I think that we have the opportunity to actually to not go that way and to be much more tolerant of each other and kind of open to having those conversations. So I think all of that I would call some kind of moral fiber within our diaspora community. I think that it's definitely the role of the diaspora to those who choose to take this on, and I don't think it's not a role that I think is easy. I think it is a burden, but I think that if you choose to, then I think that it's very helpful to kind of save Israel from itself at this point. The government is not going down a path which is justifiable. I think that things are only getting uglier and uglier, although we're seeing Gaza less and less in our news cycles. That doesn't mean that the humanitarian crisis is resolving or that anything is getting better over there. And I think that it's really important for us to continue hold Israel to account and to hold the Israeli government to account for all of its policies. So yeah, I think essentially anyone who's tuned in here, you're already doing the work, you're having the conversation, you're here to listen, you're involved with Yachad or NIF. I think those are really important organizations. So I think, continue to have that engagement, to create those spaces of conversation. I think all of that is only bringing good into the world.
Yeah, I think when this question kind of brings me back a couple of years, maybe it was a year and a half ago or something like that, when our wonderful finance minister Metzer visited the UK, and you'll probably all remember that wonderful moment when he was just roundly rejected by the whole of the UK Jewish community, almost everyone in the UK Jewish community, and I think in other places too, where basically the message was very clear that we're not willing to tolerate any of what Smotrich stands for, like, and things he said, and his homophobia, and his kind of Jewish supremacy, and all of the things which, unfortunately, here in Israel we've kind of forgotten, maybe. That's something that we can expect from politicians, is to actually have like some kind of morality. I don't know, and it doesn't. It's all really disintegrated, and that was really an inspiring, like a very hopeful moment for me when I saw how well the Jewish community in the UK dealt with that moment. And I think for me, when I think about the role of the Jewish community abroad, is I think it's about kind of being there to set these red lines, which unfortunately here in Israel we've crossed. And we don't have any red lines anymore, because every time there's a new low, we kind of manage to beat it with another one. And there's something about the diaspora community that's able to remind us of certain standards and to set those standards. And I think that the Israeli government has been very good for many years at trying to create this kind of this equivalence. I was talking before about how there's no like legitimate criticism of Israel from Israel's point of view, but like creating this kind of equivalence between that criticism of the occupation and criticism of Israel. And I think it's kind of our responsibility as kind of the diaspora, if I'm wearing my diaspora hat, to make it clear to the UK government and to other governments around the world where Jewish communities are, have a strong and important voice in society, that equivalence doesn't exist. And actually the opposite is the case, that if you are supporters of Israel, and I hope that these governments will remain somewhat supportive of Israel, but of us, of Israelis, not of our crazy government. But in order to do that, you need to be critical of the occupation, because the only way that we'll continue to exist as a state is if we solve this problem.
Thank you. I'm perhaps over-encouraged people to be active in the Q&A, because now we have lots of questions and I'm not going to manage to get to them. But our speakers are happy to stay for an extra 10 minutes. So if everyone is happy to listen for an extra 10 minutes, that would be great. I'm going to do one final question each. If I could ask everyone to try and keep their answers to kind of 2 to 3 minutes. I know that's really difficult on these topics. One question that's come up a couple of times in different ways, but we also get asked this very often, is about partnerships with Palestinians and progress in Palestinian society. So I'm going to ask this to Anton. Kind of about what work do you do with Palestinians, what progress is being made in Palestinian society. Yeah, please share.
Thank you, Danielle. I want to say that the last time we met in person, Danielle, was on a tour of UK parliamentarians to the Gaza border region, and there we went to Kibbutz Be'eri with Yotam Kipnis, who was a peace leader from the Zazim organization. It was his first time going back to the home where his parents were murdered. And as he was speaking to us, you know, in the background, you could just hear this incessant noise as the Israeli Archaeological Association was sifting through the dirt for human remains months after. I mean, we're seeing some of the worst trauma that humanity can see. And in some ways, it's understandable that the levels of mistrust and hatred in both societies are peaking at the moment. If you survey Israeli society and if you survey Palestinian society, the levels of mistrust, of racism, of hatred are off the charts. And in many ways, it's unsurprising. And while that sound of sifting for human remains will haunt me, I remember the words of Yotam and also of Avi Dabush, the director of Rabbis for Human Rights, who is himself a survivor of the October the 7th massacre and still a displaced person with his family. That, you know, the roadmap has changed, but their values has not. That they still believe in creating a shared future here where people can live with safety and security and dignity and equality. And that's remarkably inspirational to hear from survivors of a massacre. Our response as Rabbis for Human Rights almost immediately, I mean, we were calling for a ceasefire within a week of the beginning of the war. But our response was much more than talking, it was about action. How do we build more Palestinian partnerships now than we had before? How do we build to go forward? And so by early November, we had the privilege to join a humanitarian aid campaign, which was mainly funded by Israeli Jews through crowdfunding and hundreds of volunteers involved. And we delivered, quite literally broke our bodies delivering about 85 tons of humanitarian aid to Palestinian communities in the West Bank. And while this might seem like a one-sided approach, as in we're coming in and we're giving something, in order for Jewish Israelis to come into Palestinian villages and towns, you have to have a partner on the ground. And for the first time after, you know, for the first time, I started to feel that the Palestinians were providing me with a protective presence, that there was this need for a level of trust and, you know, this feeling of solidarity, that we were doing something together and that they were really kind of vouching for me as well. And so currently we're working on an interfaith march. It's going to be happening in 2 weeks' time on June the 3rd in Jerusalem. It's the Jerusalem Interfaith March for Human Rights and Peace. And it is an event that is a partnership between Jews and Palestinians, faith leaders, both from within Israel and from the territories. And it's an opportunity to showcase that there are shared values, that this is not a binary conflict with two narratives of us and them. And if it is a binary conflict of us and them, then it's between those of us who believe in a future for our children, where they can live, where they can meet each other, where they can create a different reality, and those who are looking for endless war. And so, you know, the partnerships that we have with Palestinians at the moment have grown. They're very meaningful. And it's an area that I think everyone should be focusing on at the moment, is Jewish-Palestinian partnership.
Thank you. I feel like I should have left you for last, because that's quite uplifting, and it's a good reminder of no one can do the work that's done in this community without Palestinian partnerships. So my next question is for Rebecca, because I feel like we haven't maybe touched quite enough on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and we hear a lot of conflicting narratives, especially in the kind of Hezbollah camp and from what's coming out of Israel. So I think maybe it would be great if you could share with us, I know it's very hard to do a quick summary, but a kind of summary of the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza and where we're at.
I can. I think with only a few minutes left, as you said, I think that it will be hard to do it justice, and also it will be hard to leave all of our guests, who I really appreciate joining, with any kind of sense of hope if we end on that. But of course, I will touch on it. As I mentioned already, you know, we know about the very, very high death count, and as well as the lack of healthcare and the increased reports of malnutrition. You know, we've heard about around 30 people, mostly children, dying of malnutrition. And that's just the count of people who have made it to hospital before their deaths. So there could be many more who didn't make it to hospital. The healthcare system is completely compromised by the war, the Israeli bombardments, as well as the siege policy. You know, we heard about this policy of no food, no water, no nothing right at the beginning on October 9th from Gallant. And unfortunately, it seems that those sentiments haven't been reconsidered. And while policy has various times kind of opened up some aid routes, especially when there is scrutiny from either Gisha's petition in the High Court, along with 5 other Israeli Israel-based and Israeli human rights organizations, or whether it's scrutiny from the international community. There have been some kind of movements towards opening up more aid routes, but essentially most of those have been reversed since the Rafah offensive began, and the Rafah crossing has been closed since early May. The Kerem Shalom crossing is not very accessible because of the Israeli control there and the military presence, as well as the active hostilities. So we have seen a massive decrease in the aid that's going in. There is what's called the Erez West crossing, which is kind of, it's in Zekim or Asiafa, which are the kind of 2 villages on either side, on the Israeli side and the Gaza side respectively. So it's kind of called variously those things. But it's only really letting in a trickle of aid as far as we can tell. There are, you know, some goods that might be going to the private sector, but it's not very clear. There isn't transparency. We don't really have the ability to track what's been going on since the Rafah offensive began. So obviously, with everything that I've said, the kind of stories that we were hearing about the horrific conditions, with, you know, hundreds of people sharing a shower, people living in tents, that was all in the Rafah Governorate. Now we've seen that so many people have now been displaced. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced from Rafah. So, you know, there are no words to describe the humanitarian catastrophe that's going on in Gaza right now. If you want to hear more about Israeli policy on Gaza before October 7th and since then, I did give a talk with Yachad, which I know Yachad has on your YouTube. So you can always go and watch that if you're interested to hear more about the work of Gisha and what's going on in Gaza. But I think, you know, as I mentioned, it's something which cannot be addressed while this war is ongoing. Only a ceasefire it's not that a ceasefire is the ultimate goal. A ceasefire is step 1 to begin to address this humanitarian catastrophe, because there is no way to address what's going on in Gaza while active hostilities are going on, while bombardments are going on, because of all of those things. The aid can't get to the people who are starving, who are dying of starvation. So, you know, it's really important that I mention that here, but obviously I would have preferred to be able to talk about the incredible role of the diaspora and all the things that you all can do to change that reality after having addressed that. But I am grateful for the questions from the Q&A to be able to talk about that, because it is important that we all continue to talk about it, as painful as it may be.
Thank you. So just one quick final question for Jojo, which you may or may not want to go into detail on, is around one of the issues we keep seeing is around settler violence, which has been increasing not only under this government, but also in trying to prevent aid from going into Gaza. And we've seen amazing work from, I think, led by Standing Together, but other volunteers from the human rights communities trying to stop settler attacks on trucks. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that.
Well, I'll try to keep it short. And I just want to add to that sentiment that it's really good to see that there is kind of some movement in terms of activists on our side of the spectrum who are really putting themselves on the line. I guess, Anton, you're one of them, so thank you, in terms of protecting aid and making sure it gets through. I just want to say about settler violence that it's very important to remember that we're not talking about crazy radical individuals who just enjoy hurting people. Maybe they do as well, I don't know, but this is really it's a problem of the states. It's state-backed settler violence, because really the whole system is kind of built up in a way that allows it to happen, and kind of gives settlers impunity, both because of the fact that there's just two legal systems in the West Bank, which are, gives like automatic privileges to settlers over Palestinians, but also because of our attitude in general as settlers. We see them as kind of pioneers, we being Israel. And I think there's been just the best example is during this war, there's been the use of or kind of like an activation of a mechanism called Hagmar, which is Haganah Merchavit, like regional defense units, which are basically volunteer settlers who are part of like emergency response teams within settlements, who that's in normal times. They've been enlisted during this war as reservists. So basically we've come to a situation where the same settlers who have been extremely violent in the past are now able to carry out their violence with IDF uniforms and IDF weapons, and that's something it's very, very scary, but it really shows it really kind of demonstrates how settler violence is state violence, just done either in IDF uniform or not in IDF uniform. I think maybe just my request to the people who are in the audience and generally to our friends abroad is that despite all of this, don't give up on us. Don't give up on this, this project, because we need our our diaspora alliances in order for there to be a better future here. And I really hope that people won't come to the conclusion that there's nothing to look for here because it's lost, because I don't think all hope is lost. I think we can really make sure that we can find a way to a better future in this part of the world, and it's going to need a lot of help from Israelis and from Palestinians and from the international community. So that's my message of hope to end with.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious we've run over, and I'm grateful for everyone for giving up their evening to be with us. Huge thanks to Joel, Rebecca, and Anton. In particular, it's been really, really interesting. And whilst elements of this conversation have been very depressing, you guys always give us hope. At Yachad and NIF, we couldn't do anything that we do without our partnerships on the ground. So we're so grateful for everything that you do, and yeah, you do give us hope, and hopefully everyone has left with an inkling that the difficult work is being done here on the ground, and what we need is you to support the voices of those doing that difficult work, those challenging the narrative, whether it be by attending events, uplifting voices online, donating if you can, show up and help the people doing the work, I think is what we're asking for, so that we can make better changes. I'll end on that. Thank you again for everyone for attending, and I'll speak to you soon.